Good morning. So let me thank you, by the way, and thank you for being here. This morning, we thought we would kind of diverge from the typical kinds of presentations that designers like to give, which are generally eye candy, where you brag about your work and, people get all excited about composition, color, layout, snappy headlines, all of which we still love to do as creatives. But what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to have my partner, this is Pat Palmer, he's going to take the baton from me in a minute, but we're going to kind of share the sort of right brain, left brain approach that we take at VSA, which is kind of a mirror image of probably what you guys are going to be challenged by when you get out and enter the business world, whether you become a data designer, whether you become a graphic designer, whether you become a brand manager, a business manager. A lot of what we'll talk about is how those things are converging. We're going to give you a little peek at our personal journey because every one of you, when you get out of school, are going to have a different trajectory. You're going to have a different set of steps that take you where you're going to go in your career. And we'll show you the strange way we got to where we are. But the important thing to note is every one of you will have a different and unique journey. It's your beliefs, your ideals, your passion, your understanding mentioned, how you embrace the world and what's going on that we believe will shape you. I'm going to start with this quote because it's such an aspirational tome for me. It's Harry Bertoia, famous designer, designed across multidisciplines. He's really talking here about the aspirations and intention and optimism of design. So after all, designers are problem solvers, they're storytellers. But somewhere hidden, there's this grain of an idea that kind of sets a fire and creates a catalyst for doing things better, doing things more uniquely. And that's what really makes the world go around. If we were all doing the same thing and cranking out a commodity, we'd have communist rule is what we would have. So really what I'm talking about is not design in the little d sense, but design in what we call the big D sense. And that really means the complete sort of multidisciplinary process of designing, how it influences both how you work and how that work influences the people, the clients, society, everybody you serve. And that is really sort of the fortunate place where I started. But I thought it was pretty interesting. We were born in a very kind of rigid Republican Midwestern existence, but sort of what shaped us growing up was really bad television because we didn't have digital media. We didn't have compressed videos. We didn't have YouTube. But by God, some of that comedy, these guys must have been doing really great drugs who wrote Batman and Green Acres because, that was our media stimulus. I also am proud to say I'm a digital native. This is Pong. Anybody ever play? I have this concept that Pong's going to make a huge comeback. It's like vinyl records. Can you imagine people spending hours on their little Atari machine doing this? This was our introduction to technology. When I was in high school, I had this creative appetite. Pat did too. We both were enchanted by advertising. And I was in my high school library one afternoon, and I saw this book, and it was the best of advertising for the 70s. And I saw these ads for Volkswagen where there's just this beautiful, simple expression about the meaning around that ugly little car. But Helmut Krohn, who designed that, sort of captured the imagination of the world. And, it was really kind of broadcast media was the biggest influencer of consumerism back then. At the same time, I was at a nearby art store in Peoria, Illinois, the raging metropolis of Peoria. And the owner of the store, she's, you look like you're exploring and you're interested in art. What do you like? And I said, well, I kind of interested in advertising. And she gave me a copy of Communication Arts, and then she gave me a box of press type. This was sheets of dry transfer type that you could make your own headlines and create your own ads. So I was like 16 years old, and I was off to the races. I thought, okay, this is really cool. Started doing posters and programs for the high school plays and the athletic teams, and I think, okay, this is actually something I can do for a living. So I went on to college, and the very first day I walked into my design course, the professor, without even introducing himself, went up to the blackboard and wrote this message on the blackboard, and he turned around to the class with this simple directive: never stack type. So at that moment, I was introduced to design. And little did I know that the antithesis of that kind of thinking or teaching was the real essence of design, because design's about breaking the rules. It's about, intentionally walking outside a convention, taking a risk, making your mark in the world. I headed into Chicago. This was the natural thing to do when you're 60 miles away. Chicago had this wonderful and colorful design history that drew me to it. It's the work of great typographers like Oswald Cooper, great ideas of Western Man, John Averill's illustrations, the early identity programs of Unimark, editorial design by Art Paul, Rick Valiceni, an up-and-coming designer breaking all the rules with his early poster work for the Lyric Opera. It was a time and a place that had history and gravitational pull for a young, fresh, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed designer. What the other interesting thing about Chicago was it was sort of the epicenter for the first place where a corporation actually embraced design as a key part of how a company operated. So on your left, you'll see Walter Pepke, who started the Container Corporation. On your right, you'll see a pioneer of design named Herbert Bayer. And if you get a chance to do a little investigation, you'll find out that what happened here is Walter's wife, Elizabeth Pepke, had been spending a lot of time at the new Bauhaus that had come over and established itself in Chicago. And she was fascinated by the intersection of art, humanity, design, and how that could be a modern model for thinking and a modern model for how, in her husband's case, how a corporation could begin to identify itself and be culturally relevant. If you want to look at a perfect contemporary corollary to that, you might just look at Steve Jobs and what he's done. Many of the same thoughts. Well, what was interesting, out of the work that Pepke did, he started the Aspen Institute. And this is a picture from 1951. This is the first Aspen Design Conference, where he really wanted to open up the eyes of the world to this intersection of business and design. And the title for that conference was Design as a Function of Management. Kind of rigid, but it opened up a dialogue that continues today. A participant at that conference was my co-founder, Robert Vogel. He's 90 years old now. He's in the middle. If you kind of look at that photo, you have, I call this the power trio. You have Massimo Vignelli, one of the great pioneers of graphic design. And to your right, you have maybe the first design thinker, and that's Jay Doblin, who pretty much introduced the thought of design thinking. But Bob and I met. I was at a conference like this. I went up to Bob at college and said, boy, I really connected with your message. He said, well, give me a call. Come into Chicago. So that started a conversation that ended up beginning to expose to me the fact that design, while it's a passionate and creative path of study and something that could really become my personal zeitgeist, it's also an applied art. It's not like we're sitting at a studio with oil paints expressing ourselves. We were really doing work that's in service of an outcome. And in our case, back then it was called commercial art. It's really applying design towards business challenges that'll help the world work. So he calls me up. He said, let's grab lunch. He said, I'm about to sort of reset my career. And I said, so what do you want to do? He goes, I want to create the design firm of the future. I said, what? The design firm of the future. It sounds like something out of the Jetsons. What is that? And his whole thought was this is going to be the convergence of what he saw as being the best and brightest aspects of a designer, where they're thinkers, crafters, communicators. The ability to embrace human-centered approaches to problem solving, stuff that he learned from George Nelson and from his friends at Container. And then how can you, in a current context, the third point is aspirationally continue to incorporate living and lasting aspects that will be pervasive as the world evolves into creating that bigger, more contemporary version of what design can do. I've talked about how we started, my journey, but about the promise of design in a world that is passionately and maybe sadly steeped in performance. When I say performance, there's not a practicing designer in this room who probably doesn't get the question when they go into the first client meeting, okay, we like your work. What's going to be the effect of your work? Is it going to grow market share for me? Is it going to move the needle? Do you have data analytics to prove your creative hypothesis will work? And what's interesting about that is our industry has evolved very, very quickly because we're living in the age of convergence where media, design, expression, user experience is happening at breakneck speed, and there's a convergence of messages and data streams that are making it harder and harder for us to penetrate and get our messages through. But that's exactly why I believe design is important, because it's the big differentiator and it helps us slow down and create real meaning in a world that may, at times, lose the very essence of meaning because there's so much going on. The top half represents how we started the company with this idea that strategy and expression, strategy being the way we think about problem-solving outcomes, the strategic intent of what we're doing, coupled with design expression. But about 9 years ago, we decided to add to this and pivot towards, because we were getting questions asked by our clients, how do you actually move the needle from experiences into insights? And that second half of the circle here is what Pat's going to talk a little bit about today, and he's also going to share a new, debuting actually, a new index we created that talks about that critical connection around how design can be measured in the sense of brand meaning and brand performance. But this is kind of the axis to which at least we at VSA are challenged with every day. It's an overlay for how we've built the firm. The first half of our existence was mainly hiring people up here who are great strategists and great designers. But in the last 10 years, Pat and his team have really helped elevate and integrate strategic practices, strategic talent that helps us fill out that equation. And the reason there's a circle here is we believe it's virtuous. The stuff you learn from marketplace success or failure is going to go back in to feed the strategic point of view, and then how is design going to react to that and in a proactive way. As I hand the mic over to Pat, I want to just share three important aspects of what we believe modern designers in the modern age are going to have to think about. This work, this is 3 points out of a study that I encourage you to look at AIGA.org called Designer 2025. Meredith Davis hosted this study and has posted an outlook for what the industry and what talent is going to be challenged with and the challenges and opportunities that exist. 3 of those areas are breaking down complexity. Designers have an innate ability to look at the whole picture and to break down complex ideas, metrics, thinking into real digestible expressions. I call that the making of meaning. We're also challenged today because brands behave differently in the marketplace to bridge the physical experience, something we're doing today, with digital experiences. So if you're walking through your favorite store, you're buying something online, and then you're experiencing it in the marketplace, what is the complexion of that universe, and how do all those pieces fit in this omni-channel world we live in? And then finally, we're going to be forever challenged with what we call new forms of sense-making. So back when I started, it was print and television. Now it's everything. You have 10,000 songs in your pocket. You have probably 5 or 6 platforms you're interacting with. You go to a store, and it's a whole different experience than it was even 5 years ago. So designers, thinkers, business people are going to be challenged and inspired by these 3 factors or forces that will continue to play into the way we think and how our work makes a difference in the world. So with that, I'm going to toss this over to Pat, and he's going to give you, if there's a right and left brain, we're going to turn it over to the science of what we do, and this is a perfect segue for Pat.
And I finally got off the farm. I was 42. No, I'm teasing, of course. Some of you asked at the beginning as I was mingling, how did you get here and how did you become a designer? Of course, I'm not a designer necessarily. I work at a design firm, and I sometimes like to think of myself as a designer, but the path is long and winding, and as we saw the hands raised earlier, all the different backgrounds, I think each of you are probably passionately interested in how you get from where you are to where you want to be, and how your design training or business thinking gets you there. And so I thought it would be worthwhile to just share a little bit about the journey that I came through and how I ended up at Leo Burnett after a long career in advertising and spent, and this is not really the way it looks. It's actually green. I actually dimmed it to make it look like the Dark Tower. But it was actually a lovely place. It was a great place to work, and I enjoyed every minute that I was there, probably about 10 years. One of the things that really intrigued me about Leo Burnett and our clients were giant and multinational, and we did amazing creative work. But one of the things that was always exciting is there were a strange group of data scientists locked in a corner, I think on the 19th floor, and you had to have a special security pass to get in there. And they were strange and wonderful people, but you couldn't really access them very often. You had to have a reason to talk to them. And they were PhDs in analytics and statistics, and they were locked away because data science had not yet become the sexiest career on the planet as it is now, as some of you probably know. So data science was not a thing 7 years ago when I joined VSA Partners. Now it's a thing. So I was intrigued by that and excited, and when Dana called and said, we are creating the next iteration of the design firm of the future, would you be interested in joining? One of the first things I did is I said, and he agreed, we're going to bring data science into a design firm and see what the hell happens. And strangely enough, a guy walked in about 3 weeks after I started, and I'd run an ad or a LinkedIn or whatever they do to get people. And this guy walked in wearing a tweed jacket and strange kind of stained shirt, and he was named Charlie Hammerslaw, and he was PhD from Princeton University and undergraduate, I think, in Yale, in statistics and demography. And he had just been thrown out of his job. He was jobless because he had been head of modeling for the Obama campaign. And of course, he'd won the election and now wanted work. So we started this endeavor of creating an integrated offer within a design firm that would think about data in new and different and exciting ways and integrate it into strategy. When I started at VSA, I got a lot of notes of congratulations, a lot of notes of puzzlement. Why are you going to a design firm? My mom wrote, you can't even draw. Why are you doing this? But my favorite quote of all was probably from a mentor of mine, Tom McConaughey, a fantastic creative leader and designer in his own right. He was the art director to Hal Riney, if any of you know who Hal Riney was at Ogilvy in the day. And he wrote this note, and I didn't know what it meant. He said, I see you finally ended up in a good place. Maybe now you can make a difference in this world. And I didn't know exactly how to take that. I think it was a compliment. It was certainly a compliment to VSA Partners. And I didn't really understand what it meant until I got there. And that happened on I think it was my third or fourth week, and I was with a designer, I think a design strategist actually, and she asked how things were getting along and how I was adapting from coming from the world of advertising to the world of design. And she said, you know, one thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to check your cynicism at the door. You can't be a cynic and be a designer. And that was a puzzling comment. She said, look, this is the way it is. In an ad agency, you're always going to have insidious cynicism, because no matter what you do, you know you can never really solve the real problem. You can only figure out what to say about it. A designer is inherently optimistic. They believe they can get at it. Even if they can't, they believe that they can. And while there's a tinge of realism about what a designer does, the ability to solve human problems through design is pervasive. And I found that absolutely to be true within VSA. We try to figure it out. We try to solve it. The other thing I learned along the way is design was probably very different than what I thought it was. If you think about, this is Paul Rand, for those of you who don't know, who worked on IBM and Next and many other things, crossing boundaries. Design is a lot of things, but the one thing it is not only concerned with is aesthetics. It's very much concerned with the way things perform, the way things work. And because VSA was born of that tradition, and actually Dana spent time with Paul Rand and was not a contemporary, I won't say that, but at least she met him. We were always born of this idea that no, it's not necessarily how things look. Yes, it's how things look, but it's also how things work. We are obsessed with how things work, how things function. And the design of brands is every bit as interesting and challenging as the design of anything or a product or a website. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how are brands really designed, meaning how do they really work? And these are some of our clients along the left that we spend, I think, most of our time thinking about. But as we became obsessed with this, we started to recognize that we in marketing are at a bit of an inflection point as things are changing around us, and Dana mentioned this in his section. You, as you go forward in the world of design, will constantly be challenged by the other side of the equation, people who want to and are able to frequently quantify every aspect of the marketing mix and try to prove it out. Those of you who I met at the beginning who might be majoring in computer science or data science and are interested in design, this is the intersection of this world. Because as marketing happens, it's increasingly algorithm-driven, and performance can be modified, optimized, driven down to the nth level. And everyone wants to ask the question. There's no CMO on earth that can make a decision without also saying, this is how I think it will work in dollars and cents. This is because the rise and the explosion of data makes it possible. If you imagine, just by 2020, 1.75 megabytes of new information will be created every second. That's about the equivalent of a 4-minute YouTube video every second. In that data are enormous insights into individual buying behavior. And as those things are modeled and optimized second by second and minute by minute, the right message, the right time, the right person at any given second in the world, people will start to ask, and they're already asking, do brands even matter? And ask Alexa to order toilet paper and see what you get. It may not be a brand unless it's Amazon's. So you begin to think, in this world with voice and data optimization, what does it really mean to be a brand? So we started to think, could design bridge the divide? There's a dichotomy or a bifurcation between brand building and performance marketing or business building, and could design somehow bridge the divide? And just inspired by this quote, which I think is interesting, it wasn't our goal to throw one out over the other. Rather, it was, could we reconcile these things? We have to quantify everything, but we also feel like we know what is right through our understanding of human beings as designers, and could we apply a quantitative model to that? We started about a year ago to think deeply as designers do about the relationship between the two distilled elements of what a brand might be, promise and performance. If you think about it, a brand is nothing more than that. It's a set of communications, it's a set of ideas that are somehow put into the marketplace, and then ultimately it's a set of performances, the experiences that a brand provides. And we started to think, how could we as VSA, as designers, reconcile the two sides of that and bring it together? And of course, it brings you to the age-old question, do you really want to underpromise and overdeliver as a brand? And I was reminded of this in a very poignant moment a few weeks ago. I was with my family in Palm Springs, California for spring break with my two sons. And it was a really hot day in the valley, and everybody wanted to go on the tram ride. If any of you ever taken the tram ride to the top of Mount San Jacinto, it's a really nice way to cool off. And we drove up there with high hopes. It's a beautiful alpine forest at the top. The last time my son was there, he was 5. He's now 25. So there was a great moment that we were all excited about, taking the picture on the same log and all that kind of thing. We got up there to the halfway up the mountain you have to drive up, and there's a sign that says the wait time is 3.5 hours. We mean it. And there was just a groan in the car, 3.5 hours? We can't spend 3.5 hours waiting for the tram. There's nothing to do. So I said, well, you've got your iPhones. But then we actually moved on, and I said, well, let me just drive up to the top of the mountain, halfway up, and see how long it really is, because maybe we can buy a ticket, come back tomorrow, etc. So I walked up. It's quite a long walk up to the top of the stairs, and as I got to the top, a little winded, I went to the person at the ticket counter and said, is the wait really 3.5 hours? And he said, no, it's 45 minutes. 45 minutes, here's your tickets. And I kind of ran back down to the car, and I was thinking about two things. I was thinking about how many other disappointed families were turning around that day, and their kids were not going to the top. And I also thought, how much lost revenue for the state of California park system today because you underpromised and wanted to overdeliver. And so at the core of it really is, how do you calibrate those things? How do you make sure what you promise is what you deliver? And how do you make sure what you deliver can be promised in a complicated marketplace? We decided to measure that through a pretty large quantitative study, where we wanted to distill promise and performance to a simple formula that could be applied, not rigidly, but applied to any kind of brand. In our methodology, I'm not going to go into detail, and I do have lots of charts and graphs, and I'm not going to share them all with you. But essentially, we scoured the web, packaging, advertising, any place we could find it. Initially, we did it manually, then we used AI to do it. We found the promises, the things that brands said publicly about themselves. We then counted the most frequent promises and coded them into a battery by brand. We then assessed them really over three things. One is attribution. Do you get credit for your promise? The second, influence is an important promise. And the third is, do you actually deliver? And we did that across a large number of brands. We then created a model with Charlie, an algorithm that basically organizes those inputs into a model that correctly and accurately predicts two basic predictors of brand success. One is net promoter score, and the other is brand equity. And those things were embedded. We generated a score to 100, and then we built a simulator using Bayesian statistics to say, okay, if one thing changes, what happens to everything else? Then we applied that and we tested it. These are all the charts and graphs that I will not share with you today. There is an address at the end where you can go and get more information, but I'm not going to go through all of it. But this is basically the model. There is a set of factors, an algorithm that correctly predicts the attribution, influence, and delivery of a promise. We then created a new metric that we call the promise to performance score, which essentially says anything less than 100, there's a chance to optimize one of those three variables. Anything more than 100, there's a chance to optimize market share. And we applied that across a bunch of different categories. We assessed actually 5, one of them kind of disappears in here, but 5 big consumer banks, and what you find, the usual suspects, under delivery on a low ranking promise and not much meaning created by banks. So in the grand scheme of things, you probably wouldn't be shocked to find that some of the banks rank low, but they're easy to beat up. They really are, because they have a tough job. But what about airlines? Here we see a massive disparity. We have a couple of heroes, and I'll reveal who they are toward the end, and some of the usual suspects which don't take care of animals and drag passengers off planes might be rated low in this promise to performance. They don't promise to do that, but they certainly perform. Then the next one was news outlets, and here was some surprising results because they all perform equally well, but it turns out that one brand gets a lot more credit for what it does than anybody else. They actually are attributed for their promise. Anybody want to take a guess who that is? Then we have mattress brands, which we chose a bunch of mattress brands because they all make terrible promises that are impossible to prove and really are forgotten a week after you get the product. And we thought, well, surely there's a problem here. But in fact, one brand was better than all the others, and it's not at all the one we expected. We tried luxury cars, and one up at the top is absolutely unfair. I'll tell you right now, it's Tesla. I regret putting it in there because it's so good and so powerful that nothing else even compares. But the real insight is in the middle. What happens in the middle part of these brands that don't rank toward the top? Then we tried and failed at predicting the success of business-to-business teleconferencing services like Zoom Meeting and GoToMeeting. And I remember the day that we decided we were on a Zoom meeting and we said, this really sucks. We should try this category. And really, the model didn't tell us anything about that. But then we fed it all into a model, and ultimately we got the top 5 and the bottom scores. And I will, because it's small type, I'll share that the top 5 were Tesla, Southwest, Sleep Number, Fox News, and another surprising one, Spirit Airlines, which I'll talk about why Spirit does so well. Maybe some of you, many of your college students, maybe you got here today on Spirit Airlines. The bottom 5, United, American, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Cadillac, but not necessarily for the reasons that you would expect, and we'll talk about why those things are. We then can plug any of that into a simulator. And what the simulator would allow us to do is control for, this uses Bayesian statistics, to control for any one variable and predict the outcomes in all of the other variables. So we just tried this with a bank, and we said, let's try a bank and see if we can do anything for it. We just went and increased the baseline attribution by 10 basis points, so to 0.43, and we were able to predict what happens to net promoter score, brand equity, and all of the other variables. So now a brand marketer doesn't have to, if you're a designer sitting in the room and you say, you know what, we should really invest in a new brand idea, a new brand promise, and a new brand design because it will pay off. We now have a little bit more empirical evidence that it might actually do that. And that's what every CMO wants is, if I invest in this, will it make a difference in my market performance? And that's how we tend to reconcile the difference between promise and performance. So a few more conclusions, and then Dana and I will turn over to questions. One of the big insights to emerge from the study is the power of alignment. What correctly predicts market performance is the degree of alignment between a brand's promise and performance. Spirit Airlines is a wonderful example of that. If I told many of you you're flying home on Spirit today, you might get worried because it is a really bare bones experience. For those of us, and I'm looking at you older guys over there, are accustomed to flying on United and American and boarding early with our silver and platinum Premier cards and getting the royal treatment in business class because we fly a ton of miles. And so we earn that right, unfortunately. Spirit Air doesn't do that at all. They say, it's bare bones. Seats are going to suck. You're going to have to be nickel and dime to death all the way along the line. It's going to be really short room in between it. If you want to check a bag, pay for it. All of these things are going to happen. And they do. But the people who love it really love it. And that's because it's really carefully aligned between promise and performance. The second is the power of overpromising. And I'm going to break the tie right now, the age-old question. Should I underpromise and overdeliver? No, you should not. Because brands that overpromise outperform those that overdeliver by a long stretch in our study. The reason is, if you create a bold, singular promise and fail to live up to it, and it's hard, people give you more credit for that than making a bunch of easy promises and delivering very well. An example is in the automotive category. BMW, Lexus, and Mercedes-Benz are all excellent cars, and they all do well in the study. But BMW, Mercedes, and Lexus get their different. Mercedes makes a lot of promises on a lot of things and over-delivers on all of them. But BMW makes a bold promise. The ultimate driving machine has done so for 20 years and actually under-delivers slightly among its own owner base. They want even more performance, even better. It wins because it makes a singular promise and under-delivers. The third is the power of clarity. Fox News outperforms the Wall Street Journal by a wide margin, and that's because it has a very clear promise among its users. It says, and we coded for implicit and explicit promises, it says, fair and balanced news reporting, what it delivers is exactly what people tune in for, which is not that. It actually delivers extremely well, and that creates very high loyalty. And that's why, as a brand, they can charge a premium for their audience, because they know exactly what they're going to get. The final is the power of tangibility. And if I were going to, as a group of designers, I was going to make one suggestion. It's the power of tangibility in the promise, paid through the performance, all the way to the experience itself. Starting at the end with the user experience and following the thread all the way back to the promise is more effective than starting with the promise and following it to the other end of the line. Tangibility, the ability to be uniquely associated with something and actually physically do it, is important. Tesla and Southwest are two top brands. It's almost not fair to compare them because the experience of driving or owning a Tesla is so different than any other automobile. Southwest, the tangibility of the promise of freedom is so clear when you get to choose your own seat that it absolutely pays that off. But the surprising brand, I thought, mattress brands, I thought Casper is going to do great because it's a disruptor. It's written up in every article. It's a darling of the venture capital community. And actually, it wasn't the best performer. Sleep Number was. That's because the reminder, the tangibility of the promise is right there every night when you go to sleep and you press that button to lift your head up or down or lift your partner's head up or down when she starts snoring, not saying anything. But it's absolutely there. What we found out through the interviews is that Casper, once you own it, the real differentiator of Casper, the delivery mechanism, it's shipped to your door, goes away. You put a mattress cover on it, a duvet, and it's just another mattress. Sleep Number delivers the tangibility of experience all the way through the end every night when you go to sleep, and it's rewarded. We try to do that with everything we do at VSA, whether it's finding a way to give form to an idea in IBM Watson, which we named and helped create. Recently, a campaign for Kleenex, where we put these little things in this piece of outdoor communication are actually Kleenexes as pixels. We tried to put the product, the tangibility of the product, or the way through our design we capture the visceral feel and sound and emotion of a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. As designers working in marketing, we have the power to think about how to create performance at every step of the way through the long line. We believe performance is the result of designing perfectly to an intention. Performance is the result of designing perfectly to intention and bringing that all the way through every aspect of a brand experience, from the product itself to the communication to the advertising to the sales enablement. If you can build that intention through, you will succeed as a marketer. You will deliver upon your promise.